Welcome, everyone. My name is Mariana Gatto. I'm the executive director and co-founder of the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles. A special thanks to the IAMLA members who helped make tonight's program possible. We'd also like to recognize the Italian Sons and Daughters of America for their assistance promoting this program. Our guests tonight are William J. Connell, a professor of history who holds the Josephine M. and Geraldine C. Motta Chair in Italian Studies at Seton Hall University, and Stanislao Pugliese, a professor of history and the Queensboro UNICO Distinguished Professor of Italian and Italian American Studies at Hofstra University. Their book, The Routledge History of Italian Americans, weaves a narrative of the trials and triumphs of one of the nation's largest ethnic groups. This history, comprising original essays by leading scholars and critics, addresses themes that include the Columbian legacy, immigration, the labor movement, discrimination, anarchism, fascism, World War II patriotism, assimilation, gender identity, and popular culture. This landmark volume offers a Americans and Italian American experiences. So welcome, gentlemen. I'll give you a second to get your cameras on and unmute yourselves. There we are.
Hello, Mariano.
Hello, good evening. Well, first, could you tell us a little bit about how this book came about?
Oh, well, maybe I could begin. It's a great story of cultural patronage and educational patronage of a kind that the major Italian American organizations have started to undertake in recent decades. And this begins with the group UNICO, the National Charitable Organization, that in the early 90s decided to fund, raise money for, encourage at a number of American universities endowed chairs in Italian studies, Italian American studies, and Italian history and language, and research centers and libraries. About the chair that I hold turned out to be one of them, and also my co-editor, Stan Pugliese's. And it was maybe after I'd been at Seton Hall for it would be 12 years, I think, 12 or 13 years. I was at lunch with several of the leaders of this drive, and they expressed to me satisfaction with what they had done, but were looking for a way to bring their efforts together, which they felt were perhaps too scattered among different universities, and wondered what could be done. So I said that right now the scholarship is so remarkable in the field of Italian American studies, and yet there's not a single book that brings it all together. And it's something that we need also as teachers for our courses, a way of presenting the full scope and panorama of Italian American studies, rather than a kind of simple narrative that's been passed down through the major media, through films and the like. And so I presented it that way. And the next morning I got a call saying, yes, we want to do this, and we'll fund it. And I said, great, that's what we need. And they said, and you have to do it. Whereupon I quickly called my friend Stan Pugliese, because it's a task, I think, that goes beyond a single person. It really requires expertise across 5 centuries and many disciplines. And together we put together an all-star group of writers, of experts for each chapter, covering these 500 years of the Italian experience in America.
And what can readers expect to find inside? There's so many facets of the Italian American experience, as you mentioned. What are some of the various chapters and topics that you cover?
So maybe I'll answer that question. First, I have to say, I still remember that phone call from Bill, which is now about 9 years ago. I think it was 2012.
That's right.
And Bill actually deserves the lion's share of credit for this project because he certainly was the prime mover in the Aristotelian sense. I mean, he came up with the idea, he came up with the funding, and he really moved heaven and earth to get this project done. Well, what happened was also what readers can expect is a kind of a critical moment in this historiography of Italian American studies, both in the United States and in Italy. There was the realization on both our parts, because we originally come from Italian studies, Bill from the early modern period, and I come from the 20th century, that in Italy, there was extraordinary work being done on Italian American studies. It was no longer the case that, the older generation of Italian scholars looked down their noses at Italian American history. We have in our volume about a dozen extraordinary scholars from Italy, including the editor of the Italian translation, which came out just last year. So what can readers expect to find here? Well, everything chronologically from like when Columbus set foot in the Western Hemisphere to the most contemporary, considerations on things like, gender identity, Italian American masculinity, images of Italian American women, and material culture. So we try to create a balance between a chronological coverage of hundreds of years of Italian American history, but as well as the main themes of Italian American history, broadly conceived. It would probably be better to say this is a work of Italian American studies, because there's everything in here from literature to sociology to even even what you might call semiotics, the study of Italian American images, which are very important.
And I believe that you prepared a little overview for us. Is that
right? Let me load this up now. Stan's last word was images. One of the things that our grant from UNICO permitted was the purchase of the rights for some really terrific photos, some of them black and white, going back to the earlier years of immigration, but right down to the present. And it's a beautifully illustrated volume.
I have to echo that. I was
one of the really great things about it. So let me see if this comes up properly.
I was pleasantly surprised. I've only made it about a third of the way through the book, but I was pleasantly surprised to see many images that I'd not seen before, and just gorgeous photographs, and it truly does bring the story to life.
Hold on. There. Is that image coming up on the screen?
Sometimes there's a couple second delay.
Do you have two book covers?
Yeah.
Is that a yes?
I don't see it yet.
No, okay, so let me try a different.
There we go.
Okay, great.
History's worth waiting for.
Thank you. There, and we'll go here. All right, so here are the covers of the two editions. The paperback edition is really actually a pleasure to open and to go through, and Routledge charges around $50, and you can get a discount if you come back to the museum's website you'll be able to find a discount that will bring the price down even further. And then our Italian edition includes two additional essays, and it's really terrific. You can send it to relatives in Italy via Amazon.it, if you like, in addition to the Mondadori website. The painting on the cover is magnificent too. It's from the Casa Italia in Stone Park, Illinois, outside of Chicago, and it puts together an image of immigrants aboard the SS Giuseppe Verdi, and in the background, Mary and Joseph on the flight to Egypt, in the version by Fra Angelico. It speaks to many of the themes in our book, and there were some things that we wanted to address. Stan spoke of the scholarship in Italy. There's also another issue, is the generational change within Italian America. So there's a kind of traditional story that's fundamental, a foundational story for Italian Americans of immigration. And this is a wonderful photo. They were posed in 1983 in Grand Hall when money was being raised by Lee Iacocca to restore Ellis Island. And Esterina Mazzucca, the woman in the front row, is the common ancestor of everybody else in the picture. It was run in Life magazine. Just a terrific image. But then there are new generations, and we wanted to reach out. The Jersey Shore is obviously a show of excess, and really doesn't represent Italian American youth, and yet they do stand for something. And there is a need to address the fact that young Italian Americans are out there. They have a sense of identity. Some of them do. Some of them are also, in a way, losing their identity. We have a wonderful chapter about that, about the nature of Italian American identity among the young. And then there's the question of new migration to the United States, new generations of immigration, not necessarily, well, not anymore to Little Italy's, and the immigrants have generally a good amount of education and are looking for work, and we wanted to include them. So there's a terrific chapter on new immigration to the United States. There's also there are chapters of standard Italian American history that tend to leave out developments of the 60s and 70s for different reasons. And a story that struck me and that I tell in the book's introduction regards the difficult, almost the adoption almost denied this Italian American couple. They were foster parents to young Beth at 4 days after her birth. They lived in upstate New York. He worked for IBM, and when she turned 5, they asked to adopt her, they were turned down. The county commissioner said it was inappropriate for an Italian American couple to adopt a blonde girl, and these were the only parents she'd ever had. It made when a New York Times reporter found out about the case, it made front page news, and was considered a major. It became a major cause célèbre in the mid 1960s, with Governor Rockefeller eventually stepping in, permitting the adoption, and they changed the rules, fired the adoption commissioner, and so forth. But that Italian Americans faced this kind of discrimination on an institutional basis is something that has been easily forgotten. And here we have, let me good news came, a picture for when the good news came down. The book starts with the Voyages of Exploration. I explain, I actually set out to find an answer to the question why Columbus, Verrazzano Vespucci, and John Cabot were all Italians. Because it's not in the standard textbooks, it's not really explained anywhere, that each one of those men had access to Italian venture capitalists who were willing to invest in voyages into the Atlantic that the Atlantic monarchs were not willing to invest in. Isabella only gave enough money for about a third of the expense of Columbus's voyage. He had to go to Italian bankers to get the rest, and he never repaid those loans either. We also talk about the shift from the heroic vision of Columbus to something which is maybe more appropriate to see this from a distant perspective, small actors on a huge global stage. And something that the great artist of Western Americana, Albert Bierstadt, portrayed in 1892, but then he withdrew his painting from the competition because he could see that people back then wanted a Columbus hero. The book goes through Jefferson, the Founding Fathers generation, Garibaldi, but of course, major thrust begins with the arrival during the Great Migration from 1880 down till the imposition of quotas in 1924. We have cartoons. For instance, this is a famous one. You'll see these rats all leaving Europe. They're labeled murderer, white slaver, firebrand, convict, incendiary, blackhander, thief, and the crowned heads of Europe are celebrating that they're that the rats are leaving, and the Pied Piper, Uncle Sam, is considered fooled. He's the cartoonist is describing him as silly as he plays a horn that's called lax immigration laws, leading them all towards the Statue of Liberty at far left. There are lots of things like that from the period. But then we go into what life was really like in the Little Italies. Some terrific essays on the different approaches that historians have had to life in Little Italy. Our fantastic expert on the publishing industry in the Italian language, James Perricone, describes that how, contrary to the stereotypical image, there was a vibrant literary culture and publishing industry in the Little Italies. And he has gathered all sorts of fantastic information about the publishers, the ways books were sold, the profits that could be made from them, and shows what kind of the level that there's a much higher level of education and cultural awareness than is generally believed in the Little Italies. Mm. We have a great photo with lots of black and white photos. We've tried to bring out images of children and of women. For instance, here we have the wife and daughters all working, doing embroidery at home, while the father is sick in bed in this photo. Embroidery turns out to have been how to put it, an almost liberating thing for women in Little Italy. It became a way of earning money, and the finished goods would be taken down the street, money would come home. For women in places like Sicily and Calabria, where they had been bottled up in a kind of strongly patriarchal rural society with little freedom, Little Italy instead offered a place where they could sit and do their work in circles, watching their children together, freedom to shop, manage the household economy, and for many women coming to the United States, it was actually a liberating experience that historians have been exploring in recent years. Here we have, we cover a nice chapter on religion, family life, as I said, again, very important to our approach and to the approach that scholars take today to the history of Italian Americans. It's not just a history of heroes and celebrities, but it's a history of life as lived by ordinary people. With schooling, just as I was talking about publishing, schooling, but also leisure being important too. And we look at work. There's a great chapter about labor unions and activism, but here we have children playing hooky from school, fishermen, Boston, some great work in this book on radicalism. This is a famous image, the pyramid of the capitalist system from 1911. At the top, we have, we rule you, then we fool you for the priests, we shoot at you, the army, we eat for you, the bourgeois, the middle class, and then at the very bottom, we work for all. All. A postcard that I found this Italian version in a library in Pisa. Had been sent from the United States to a relative there. We cover criminality, organized crime, and politicians, including someone that has been. This was in his, I guess, his early career. We could say the good years of Rudy Giuliani. Here, he still had his hair, among other things. Sad episodes of discrimination and racism, including lynchings of Italian Americans. This is a lynching that took place in Tampa. Notice that the man at left has a pipe in his mouth that was stuck there by the lynch mob.
And a note pinned to the other victim.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I guess in a note pinned to the other victim. But there's also racism goes the other way. This is an ugly photo from Bensonhurst after a young African-American, Yusuf Hawkins, was beaten to death for going into this Italian-American neighborhood. So there was a protest march by African-Americans mostly, but not only African, just a protest march through the neighborhood. And these are residents protesting the protesters, telling the protesters to go home. We discussed the military. World War II is big in this in Italian-American history. And here we have a magnificent photo of a sergeant from Milwaukee meeting his cousins in Palermo. They look like cousins. This is from Vietnam. Father Vincent Campodano from Staten Island was killed performing last rites on Marines in the battlefield and was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. There's a movement from Staten Island. He's been proposed as a saint, and there are shrines to him in Staten Island. An impressive man. And the photo essay ends with images of grief. This is during World War II, Christmas Mass and fate of the boys is on their mind. And here we have a veteran's funeral beer in Hoboken in 1958. And with that, we'll pass to Stan. We'll continue with some more recent images.
Very good.
And I need to stop sharing.
Okay. And I will share and see if I can bring up. Before I continue, that last image that Bill showed, unfortunately, tragically, reminds us that we have to mention that 3 of our contributors passed away since the publication of this volume. Joanne Vruveli in 2018, Francesco Durante in 2019, and Robert Bob Viscusi in 2020. Mm-hmm. So we just wanted to remember them this evening. One of the essays is by John Gennari, a very noted scholar of Italian-American culture, but also of jazz, and specifically the intersections between Italian-American and African-American culture. Louis Prima was oftentimes called the Italian-American Louis Armstrong. I'm teaching a course right now in Italian-American histories, and the students were fascinated to learn that Black musicians in the South, New Orleans specifically, were fascinated with the Italian tradition of taking the saints out of the churches and marching in procession with them with brass bands. And so that was one of the first collaborative exchanges, cross-cultural exchanges between African Americans and Italian Americans. And Louis Prima is a representative of that.
Interestingly enough, overlooked in Ken Burns' recent documentary on jazz.
Yeah, someone should have pointed that out to him, yes. But Ken Burns sometimes has a kind of narrow vision of American history. A man who needs no introduction. I've done 2 conferences and 2 edited volumes on Frank Sinatra simply because I find him a fascinating paradox, someone who embodied both the worst and best aspects of Italian-American culture. So, as you know, when he was on the stage, his pronunciation, his diction, his professionalism, his craftsmanship were absolutely impeccable. And then when the set was over, or when the shot was over for the movie and they retired to the bar, he reverted to his kind of Hoboken hoodlum personality. I find him fascinating because I think Sinatra wanted to be both a paesano and a padrone. Never realizing that you really cannot be both. In life, you have to choose one or the other. And I think the idea of being a padrone was just too attractive for him, even though he wanted to be a friend, a paesano. So popular culture, one generation to the next. And I think we chose this image not only because of, their artistic extraordinary careers of both Madonna and Lady Gaga, but also the idea in Italian and Italian-American culture of improvisation, of being able to create out of the materials at hand. So I think that's what this photograph represents, not just their fame and their musical talent. Here is Joseph Stella. Italian Americans on the cutting edge of visual culture, of literature. We should also note the recent passing of Lawrence Ferlinghetti out in San Francisco, who for 3 generations was a prime mover of the avant-garde in San Francisco. Here are the Watts Towers built by Sabato Rodia in Watts, Los Angeles. Again, another example of the art of arrangiarsi, the art, improvisation as the art of the poor, okay? Our colleague and friend, Luisa Del Giudice, is on the forefront of trying to get the Watts Towers listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, especially as the city of Los Angeles has already tried to demolish the site already once. we have essays on Italian-American masculinity and Italian-American femininity. This is an essay by Fred Gardefee, who was the author, among many other books, of From Wise Guys to Wise Men, and the problem of toxic masculinity in Italian-American culture and models to overcome it. Here is another example of Italian masculinity, very different in the 1970s. And also, you know, essays that deal with the image specifically of the Italian-American male as a kind of clownish figure, sort of like a buffoon, which in some ways is even a more insidious stereotype than the gangster stereotype. Here is the image of Vince Lombardi, another example of Italian-American sex, but also another example of Italian-American masculinity. You know, like growing up in the 1970s, I personally did not have many role models in popular culture other than, you know, a very certain type of Italian male. And of course, you know, the extraordinary and critical role of women, not just Nancy Pelosi, but here is an image of Nancy raising the gavel as the first time that she was a Speaker of Representatives in 2007, excuse me. And of course, you know, no study of Italian-American culture is complete without an examination of religion, and specifically, you know, a very particular strain of Roman Catholicism that was brought to the United States by Italian Americans, specifically Southern Italian Americans, and the perpetuation of this religious tradition of the feast, of the cult of the saints, and all of that, very important. This is the famous Giglio feast with the towers. The tradition comes from Nola, outside of Naples, and the band playing. And one of our colleagues, Sal Primeggia, who's a friend and teaches at Adelphi University here, is actually, or used to be, one of the lifters of the Giglio in Brooklyn.
Interesting. And they were believed to inspire Sabato Radia as well. Some think.
Yes.
Yeah.
The book is also a compendium of material culture and popular culture, or what you might call folk culture. The importance of the garden, the importance of, like I mentioned before, the cult of the saints, okay? The importance of family and even nostalgia, which has its role in Italian-American culture. And also, I write about this in one of my essays, I think, in the conclusion, the idea of abbondanza, you know, the shift within one generation. My parents were immigrants. They came to America after the Second World War. They came from a culture of miseria, la miseria, you know, and that was their overriding conceptual framework of the world. The fact that within one generation, they could go from being sharecroppers and literally peasants in southern Italy, where conditions had not changed in centuries, to something like this kind of culture, you know, Italy represents the commodification of Italian cuisine on an astronomical level, you know, where you could go and choose between, as you can see here, literally dozens and dozens of cheeses. My maternal grandfather, who used to make cheese in Calabria, would have been absolutely astonished by this photograph. Not to mention the prosciutto and the meats the dried meats hanging from there, absolutely extraordinary. In my concluding essay, I talk about nostalgia and the attempt to create both Italian and Italian-American culture, both kitschy versions of this that you might find in, like, you know, the Venetian Casino in Las Vegas, but something I find a little more interesting is Castello di Amorosa in Napa Valley in California by the winemaker Dario Satui, who is the descendant, the grandson of one of the original winemakers in Northern California. Dario had gone to Italy as a young man in graduate school and become enamored of medieval architecture. And when he came back in the late 70s, he began this project to revive the family vineyard, which had been abandoned in the late 70s, including the masterpiece of the entire project, the creation of a 13th century crenellated castle that you see here, using only 13th and 14th century building materials, tools, and craftsmanship. So this is something really extraordinary, a personal crusade, literally, to resurrect something of Italian culture from 700 years ago. Here is a demographic map of the distribution of Italian Americans county by county in the United States. Obviously the Northeast, but also places like Miami, Tampa, New Orleans, but even places like Chicago, and even small mining towns in the West, and of course in California as well. And here is an image of the Columbus Monument in New York City, which we might talk about in a few minutes, especially if some of people in the audience want to raise some questions about this. In my concluding chapter, I tell the story of this church, which was built in 1906 by Italian immigrants on Sacman Avenue in the Bushwick, on the border of Bushwick and Bensonhurst in Brooklyn. By 1908, this church was featured on the cover of Architecture magazine as the greatest example of neoclassical architecture to be found in the entire United States. As you can see, if I didn't tell you that this was a church in Brooklyn, you might have taken a guess that it could be found almost anywhere in Italy. It served for over 100 years. But a few years ago, the Diocese of Brooklyn and the Archbishop Di Marzio, who actually, ironically, has 4 grandparents from Southern Italy, decided to demolish the church to make way for low-cost housing. And here is an image of the church. Actually, I apologize. I think that date is wrong, because this was the destruction, the demolition of the church in 2017. And there you see also the cornerstone, 1906. In my concluding essay, I make the argument that at the same time that a lot of people in New York City were engaged in a campaign to save the statue of Christopher Columbus, I was arguing that we should have spent at least some of our time and energy trying to save the Church of Our Lady of Loretto, because it was a more, I feel, accurate representation of Italian-American immigrant history, built by Italian-American immigrants, and also the center of their culture and their community for several generations. When I went to visit the church, a young man appeared on the street, and we started a conversation, and it turned out that he was Puerto Rican. And he told me about how the neighborhood had gone through various transformations generation by generation, but that he himself had been baptized in that church. And, you know, we were looking at it as it had been abandoned, and it was a very, very kind of melancholy moment for him as someone from the neighborhood, and for me as a historian. And we like to end with this image of the iconic fig tree in winter, which brings to mind, at least to me, Bob Viscusi's extraordinary essay about, you know, Italian-American culture and Italian-Americans living in a kind of orphanage in a way, and the danger that we have of losing not only our material culture, not only our traditions, but the struggle to try to find a way between a kind of fertile nostalgia, not a nostalgia that is sterile, that, you know, keeps pulling us back into the past with the idea that there was somehow a golden age of Italian-American history, but a kind of balancing act, you know, a kind of fertile engagement with the past. And that's probably the only way that we could move forward as a culture. And here is the final image with some the websites of the book, the original American edition, the Italian translation, and the link to the Sons of Italy website, which has our book on its book club with a discount for readers. So I'll stop my share here, and we can return to our conversation if you like.
Wonderful. And we'd like to remind the audience that if you'd like to pose a question to either Stan or Bill, that to go ahead and type your question into the comments area, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. So this first question is, we'll direct it at Stan. World War II is often seen as a turning point for Italian Americans. They were the largest and most decorated group serving in the United States military, despite the fact that the country was at war with Italy. Nationwide, 600,000 Italian Americans who had not yet received US citizenship were declared enemy aliens and were subject to a wide range of restrictions. In the decades following the war, there was this pronounced march toward whiteness and an emphasis on assimilation. What do you think the lasting legacy of World War II has been on Italian American identity?
It's a great question. I'm particularly interested in this because I've written about the reception of fascism in the Italian American community. It has to be said that, Italian Americans rather embraced fascism in the 1920s and 30s. And I think the reason is, as others have written about this as well, is that as a denigrated immigrant group being told that, you are dirty, you are criminal, you will never, speak English properly, you will never really assimilate, your religion is something crazy. And then for a movement to come along, or someone like a Mussolini to come along and to pound the podium and say, we Italians are the descendants of the Roman Empire, it fills in a kind of what I call an ideology of compensation, right? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, a lot of Italian Americans were attracted to fascism. That's not to say everyone. There was also a very strong anti-fascist presence in the Italian American communities. People like Carlo Tresca, Sacco and Vanzetti, later on, like Vito Marcantonio and others. So I don't want to give the impression that all Italian Americans were subsumed into fascism. But what's really fascinating is that, after Pearl Harbor, literally that day, the next day, Italian Americans turned on a dime, and they voiced in absolutely no uncertain terms their loyalty to the United States. So you have this tremendous and really tragic irony that some Italians who had not become citizens were placed in internment camps, although they were released when it was pointed out to Franklin Roosevelt that he needed the Italian American vote in the upcoming election, and the announcement for their release actually took place on Columbus Day. So unlike the Japanese, who spent the entire duration of the war in internment camps, Italians were released. But this extraordinary experience that here we are in America, we are fighting against our fatherland, our motherland. Our sons are even in the Italian theater, as you saw in that slide that Bill showed with his three cousins. And yet, they didn't really feel divided loyalties, which was something extraordinary. There was also a transformation on the part of Americans during the Second World War, because, as you mentioned, Italian Americans were the largest ethnic minority to fight in the war. It was oftentimes the first time American soldiers had come into contact with Italian Americans. And by the end of the war, I think most of those American soldiers came home thinking, maybe these Italians, they can really be Americans too.
Yeah, I often think of World War II as this defining moment that impacted who we became as Italian Americans in ways that we don't always necessarily even understand. a lot of the stigma surrounding being Italian American here on the West Coast, where it was particularly strong, where the majority of the evacuations and restrictions took place. I've, recorded stories over the years of Italian American families who said, we posted a sign in our business, no Italian spoken here for the remainder of the war. And they didn't start speaking it again after the war. You saw things like American households, a number of which, spoke Italian prior to World War II, and just like the dramatic decrease, the shuttering of Italian American schools or Italian language schools in the United States, Italian American newspapers. I find it fascinating as somebody who grew up here, who didn't always have a very large, prominent mirror in which to gaze into when it came to Italian American identity, how this event really impacted our lives in ways that many of us don't understand to this day.
Right. If I could just chip in, a huge impact of World War II was felt in the Italian communities. The fact of the mobility of being shipped across the Pacific, around the country, to training bases and so forth, had the effect of giving Italian Americans who were rooted in Chicago or St. Louis or in New York the experience of a larger country, other places that they could go, move to, and so there was a kind of the ability of breaking out, of freeing yourself as an individual from Little Italy and from the family. Takes off after World War II. And another thing that you see is, following up on what Stan said about Americans welcoming Italians now into a kind of general culture. You see in films that and books too, like a Bel Ferragamo, where there's an Italian American who arrives in a town in Sicily, and how he gets along with the Italians. A big popular movie, popular book, the movie Marty. On the Waterfront, Marlon Brando is an actor. There's this kind of, along with the singers, of course, but there's a welcoming and an entrance that is seen as quite positive back then.
Well, that's a great segue into our next question. Let's talk a little bit about the entertainment industry. Representations of Italian immigrants and Italian Americans as violent criminals can be traced to the earliest days of the motion picture industry. Italian American actors have themselves famously and quite memorably portrayed such characters, and often serve to reinforce these stereotypes. Despite the reckonings that have taken place within the entertainment industry in Hollywood in recent years, negative depictions of Italian Americans continue to dominate. Why are Italian Americans still fair game?
Well, I do think there's been change, actually, and it's of course very interesting that the actors who played these bad Italian Americans tended not to be Italian American themselves. The big shift takes place in the 60s when really talented actors realize that they can get roles, land good roles, good paying roles that make them celebrities by playing mafiosi, and that coincides with, of course, the great masterpieces of Coppola and Scorsese. I don't know. There's beyond that. There's a kind of character of the Western that is present in those films, and the fact that those films are so good then leads to all sorts of copycats and lesser versions, comic versions, and just sad versions of the mob movies.
Yeah. I've argued that the stereotype and that iconic image of the gangster, and Bill just alluded to this, comes really to the fore at the same moment, more or less, when the Western is starting to lose its appeal in American popular culture.
Mhm.
So as the cowboy rides off into the sunset, the gangster takes his place because he represents a type of masculinity that is different from all of us, right? Like we wake up in the morning, we shower, we shave, we go to work, we work 9 to 5, we come home on the weekends, we cut the grass, we paint the white picket fence, right? We have to pay for the car, we pay the mortgage. And here, at first, you had the cowboy, who had no strings attached, literally, right? And now you had the gangster. And in a way, this is also why like someone like Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack was so attractive, right? They were waking up like when most of us were going to bed, right? They had a completely different life. I think so that's one problem. And I think there's even a more fundamental problem, which is that, as much as we want to and have to protest against these negative stereotypes, if they satisfy some kind of deep-seated psychological, cultural archetype, then I think we have to go about it in a different way, because then no amount of protesting, no amount of boycotting is going to be able to overcome that. I think we have to understand the deep-rooted psychological archetype and why it's so attractive to American culture, and that's the only way we can address it.
The power that the gangster represents.
Exactly.
In short. So let's discuss politics a bit, another beige subject. You find Italian Americans on the left, the right, and the center of the political spectrum. From Mike Pompeo to Nancy Pelosi, Anton Scalia to Mario Cuomo, Italian Americans have achieved political prominence on both sides of the aisle. Yet in their respective parties, Italianità or Italianness seldom exists at the forefront. Why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, on the party distribution, it's the only poll I've seen from the two recent elections had about 60% of Italian Americans voting for Donald Trump. There's been a kind of seen en masse, there's been a kind of rightward shift even among Italian Americans. Why that is, I think in some ways it goes back to a theme that Stan raised, that our author, Bob Viscusi, in his chapter on the orphanage of Italian America discusses. There's among certain older generations of Italian Americans, there's a feeling of being an orphan from Italy, but then there's also a second feeling, a second occasion of alienation that occurs with moving out of the old neighborhoods in Brooklyn, in Little Italy's around the country, and a kind of separation from roots, and a strong desire then to become white, to go back to an earlier theme you already mentioned. So that's one thing. What issues could Italian Americans come together on nationally is another question. Voters, Columbus was one, and we've seen the kind of divisions that come with that. There are many Italian Americans who don't mind at all about the taking down of Columbus statues, and others who do. For them to unite on a particular issue is a difficult one. You could find them coming together in large numbers in the 1950s and 60s on immigration legislation, opening up the gates in 65 so that relatives could come in, so could have chain migration. And now, at least that 60% that voted for Trump are very much opposed to immigration of precisely that kind. It's hard to imagine Italianità unifying people right now.
Yeah. I also think we have to take a larger view. The usual interpretation was that, during the mass wave of Italian immigration, especially from southern Italy, the migrants came here like tabula rasa politically, like, they didn't have any kind of political experience. But we know that in Southern Italy, there were all kinds of political and social organizations. There were, like, the socialist leagues, the agrarian leagues. There were even Catholic leagues and unions and organizations. And even at the very local level, these società di mutuo soccorso, so there was a kind of tradition of collective action and even collective consciousness. It's also important to remember that, the Italians, they started out, many of them, on the radical left. 100 years ago, anarchists, not just Italian anarchists, but anarchists, even American anarchists who assassinated William, it was a Polish anarchist that assassinated William McKinley. Anarchists were similar to the way we think of Islamic fundamentalist terrorists today. I mean, that's the type of fear and stereotypes that were ingrained in the collective minds of Americans. And it's true that they were some of them were very radical, like the Gallianisti. Others, like Enrico Malatesta, had a more philosophical kind of anarchism that did not believe in violence. But it is also true, as Bill said, part of it is demographics, moving out of the urban centers into suburbia, where radical politics certainly was not acceptable. But also, I think, a kind of unconscious understanding that if you want to assimilate into American society, if you want to forget about having to have had checked off at Ellis Island on the form Southern Italian rather than white, and become fully accepted as white, you're going to have to accept some, I find, unsavory political ideas about race, about culture, about economics. And that's, Frank Sinatra is a perfect example of this. His mother was a ward healer in Hoboken. He was a first outspoken cultural celebrity to endorse Franklin Roosevelt when these kinds of things were not done. Big supporter of JFK. When Robbie Kennedy snubbed Frank Sinatra, it was the beginning of a political transformation for Frank Sinatra, who ended up being a big fan of Ronald Reagan. And so Frank Sinatra, in many ways, a microcosm of Italian Americans. Even politically.
Now, more recently, two of the nation's most visible figures during this pandemic have been, of course, Governor Cuomo and Dr. Anthony Fauci. Although Italian Americans are everywhere, in the sciences, academia, boardrooms, we often don't perceive people like Dr. Fauci to be the son of immigrants, of Italians from Brooklyn. Is this again a consequence of stereotypes of Italian Americans as blue collar and poorly educated? Or why do you think Italian Americans are seen as lagging when it comes to educational achievement?
Well, educational achievement, Italians are performing very well. They're one of the overperforming groups now in our country. There was a perception going back to the 1950s of, in a movie like Marty, for instance, but, workmen following family traditions and so forth. But that, I think, has changed dramatically. Fauci and Cuomo, growing up in some of the same neighborhoods, are also very different people, it should be said. They're in a way different faces or different sides of the Italian American character that you can see, at the risk of speaking in terms of in stereotypical terms. Mm-hmm. Cuomo, the harsh, willing to be a bad guy, and sometimes being one, and sort of glorying in it, and Fauci, and yet claiming to be competent. And Fauci, a kind of warm presence, but not always anxious to speak up and willing to take orders when they come down. It's been interesting to see the two of them at the same time operating and showing these different faces of Italianità, let's say.
It's also here, again, a larger historical perspective might be interesting, like that first generation of immigrants, oftentimes, as everyone knows, as you saw in some of the photographs, literally pulled their children out of public schools to do piecework, or even worse, work on farms or factories. How many memoirs do we have that tell, I was pulled out of school when I was 13 and told I had to go to work. So there was the economic necessity, but there is also something else going on, which was that, and I saw this myself growing up, the first generation in America, coming out of a rural, peasant culture, like, be careful how far your children go. Mm-hmm. And I've had, very close family relatives, brilliant, absolutely brilliant, say, I want to go to law school. And the response would be, why don't you just be a paralegal? I want to go to medical school. Why don't you just be a pharmacist? That kind of, there was always like a little bit of the pulling back, and that was a tremendous drag. Now, as Bill said, if you look at the statistics, Italian Americans, we overperform now as far as higher education is concerned. And I would even say that, every once in a while, when we have a figure like a Dr. Anthony Fauci who appears on our screens, he does more, single-handedly to dismantle those stereotypes than, as much as we can protest. Again, like growing up, like Mario Cuomo was like the first person I saw as a teenager that, represented a different way of being Italian American, intellectual, philosophical, in the 70s, you had either the gangster figure, the mafioso, or you had like the Vinnie Barbarino type, the Fonz, the Italian American male who was big-hearted, very generous, would give you the shirt off his back, very successful with the ladies, but definitely, was no intellectual, and that only slowly changed in popular culture. Some of the audience may remember someone like a Captain Frank Farillo on Hill Street Blues in the 1980s, who solved problems not by going out and smashing people over the head, but by actually, bringing gang members and criminals into the police station. And, it's like the difference in classical Greek culture between Achilles on the one hand and Ulysses on the other. Achilles solves the problem by just taking out his sword and chopping your head off, like, Sonny Corleone.
Yeah. Whereas, and you could argue that it's even more dismal when it comes to Italian American women, because there's like the gum snapping bimbo, or the mother in the kitchen, with the apron.
Right, exactly. And we've had this discussion in my class several times, the Madonna Putana complex, that not only Italian American women have to deal with, but Italian American men have to deal with. So just a kind of very quick personal anecdote that I tell my students, it was not until 1982, when I was 17 years old and my family traveled to Italy, where I saw my uncle wash a dish in the kitchen. Right, so that already that told me at that moment that Italian American culture had been stuck in 1962, at least in my family. Whereas in Italy, it was 1982, and men could actually get up and help their wives wash the dishes.
Well, now many Italian Americans embrace what you, Stan, have referred to as a culture of nostalgia. While they're unlikely to speak Italian or keep up with current events in Italy, they love everything Italian, and I'm going to put Italian in quotes, such as the home goods that are branded as Tuscan, which are seldom actually made in Italy. Meanwhile, they promote depictions of Italy and Italian Americans, via like the Italian American meme culture that kind of are frozen in time, as you just mentioned, or, border on caricature. This bleeds into the other aspects of Italian America, from our tendency to celebrate certain heroes while ignoring or remaining uninformed about Italian Americans who participated in, say, working people's struggles, and even just our own history in general as the descendants of impoverished immigrants. Why do you think that is?
I think the blame is on both sides, actually. The blame resides both in Italian American culture and in American popular culture, which tries to present a certain image of Italy, you know, and the Italians also. There's a three-angle triangle here, right? That, you know, during the post-war Italian boom, Italy repackaged, rebranded itself from, you know, rural, agrarian, peasant country to one that was urban and sophisticated. And made in Italy meant, you know, the finest handbags, shoes, cars, and clothing in the world. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's a kind of, I don't want to say a superficial way of appropriating or reappropriating Italian culture. I think, you know, sociologists and immigration historians used to talk about the melting pot, then they talked about the salad bowl metaphor. Now some of them talk about the garbage can theory of immigration. In other words, that we go back into the trash can of history and we pick out only certain things, you know, that we want. Like, you know, we want to be associated with Ferrari and Valentino. We don't want to be associated with, let's say, I don't know, Giambattista Vico or Antonio Gramsci, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the blame is all around. How do we deal with this? Well, we continue to do what we do. You know, we write our books, we teach our students, we go back and forth. You know, one of my arguments has always been Italian American studies can't move forward unless it allies itself with Italian studies, but not only Italian studies, with American studies, with Jewish studies, with women's studies, with gender studies. And only by knowing a little bit about all of those fields could you really then, I think, create a vibrant Italian American culture that is distinct from Italian culture and is distinct from American culture.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that strikes me about Italian American culture, it's one of the charming things about it from an outsider and for those who participate in it, but it's also a bit strange. It's the fetishism of monuments, of looking for masterpieces, for perfection. And I recently learned this wonderful story. It's a Los Angeles story of Jerry Garcia. He tells this in an interview in the movie Long Strange Trip. Came down with Ken Kesey and the Pranksters to Watts for what famously became the electric Kool-Aid acid test in the Watts Youth Center in 1966. And the Grateful Dead was the band. And they were distributing, well, they had a garbage can filled with Kool-Aid laced with LSD. And the story, there are many versions of it, and this story is not in Tom Wolfe's book by chance, but it's but Garcia tells it in this interview. After the concert, they went over. One version has Bob Weir and Phil Lesh wandering along the railroad tracks to discover, as the sun rose, the Watts Towers, which were about 6 blocks away. And Garcia said he instead went over in a bus. But there they are in the early morning, still tripping on LSD, and they see Sam Rodeo's amazing towers with the sparkling colors from the glass, the bits of tile and ceramic, and surprisingly, you might think that Garcia on LSD in that place would have a different response, but he says that it was a great epiphany for him, that this man had spent 35 years building this magnificent thing, and the city of Los Angeles was considering tearing it down, and he decided, and he kept this memory because the interview was from 20 years later. He decided, that's not for me. I just want to have fun. I want to experience things rather than dedicate myself to creating a masterpiece. I want to experience life. And so that became his way of approaching music and performance. And the result is, if you take it all in toto, maybe a grander masterpiece than that particular monument. And I see the Italian American experience in that way. As a historian, I'm not, I don't put that much weight on a monument to Christopher Columbus. Putting John Basilone, who was a magnificent Marine and a Medal of Honor winner, putting him on a postage stamp doesn't mean that much to me. I'd rather see them in the context of the experience of Italian Americans, of Americans, as Stan was just saying, of all Americans, and instead lower perhaps the volume on the monuments and pay more attention to living and let's face it, enjoying life.
Well, kind of on that note, one of the first questions we received from the audience goes back to the issue of the destruction of Our Lady of Loretto. And one of the viewers tonight asked if, if the church was, why the church was not a protected structure given its age, and whether there were any historical societies or Italian American groups that raised their voice in opposition to the demolition of the church.
Actually, there were groups that tried to block the demolition. They even had a court order that temporarily blocked the demolition of the structure. What was curious, what's fascinating, actually kind of hopeful, is that even though most of the Italian Americans had moved out a generation earlier, and the neighborhood was mostly African American and Latino, those three groups, Italian Americans, African Americans, and Latinos, came together in a coalition to try to save the church. They even got like bids on what it would take to save it structurally, to convert it into a community center, but to no avail. And that, I mean, what was inspiring was to see these people working together across generations, across ethnic and cultural boundaries, groups that, traditionally have not worked together. If anything, they've been fighting each other. So that was hopeful. And even though they failed, I'd like to think that they planted the seeds of a kind of cross-cultural collaboration in the future.
Now, this question, I'm going to try to, some of the questions come in a little bit, I guess you could say, paraphrase. So if I understand it correctly, one of our viewers is asking, Italian American history is largely defined as situated on the East Coast. Yet if you follow any mine or mill across the nation, you'll find pockets of Italian Americans whose experiences are just as much part of the Italian American experience than any other, community. To what degree, I guess they're planning on purchasing your book, to what degree does the text explore other communities such as New Orleans or those on the West Coast and the lives these Italian Americans built and the ways in which they contributed to the nation? I think I got that right.
Yeah, we have examples from around the country. We did not dedicate particular chapters to particular places, because then we would have had 50 chapters, or the book is 36 chapters. We would have had 36 different experiences and places. But we did try to work in lots of examples from California, from the Midwest, from the Deep South, and so forth. So I guess that's how I would explain it. For the chapter on Little Italy's, discusses Little Italy's around the country. So.
And then the next question is, which I find this one rather interesting. What do you think is the challenge, the greatest challenge facing Italian Americans? Is our task to create a unified identity, have more political power, or something else?
I would say, I know this is not the popular view, but I'm not sure it's a good thing for there to be a singular conception of what it means to be Italian American. I'm not sure that Italian Americans need to think that there's only one way, that we have to all be on the same page. As you can see, we're not even on the same page about Columbus. That I think is good. I mean, and that's probably, you know, something that we have brought over from Italy. The Italians have been noted by other people of being as, you know, notoriously individualistic, anarchistic. Some people might even argue, and I might even agree with them, that here we are more than 150 years after the Risorgimento, and Italy is still not a real nation state.
We're united on paper. Right?
Right, I mean, where most people still identify themselves first and foremost as Venetian or Roman or Sicilian or what have you. That too is not necessarily a bad thing.
Mhm.
As I like to tell my students, the nation state is so 19th century. You know? So why is it that Italian Americans, I mean, in some ways we can be more like other ethnic groups, I guess, but the Jews are famously famous for their disputatious nature, going all the way back to the Middle Ages. You know, the old joke is, you know, 3 Jews in a room and you have 4 opinions. That's the same with Italians, and that's not a bad thing because it keeps the culture alive, I think. And I don't think it would be good that like all Italians would be either all on the left or all on the right, or culturally this or culturally that. It is part of a mosaic. I think, in fact, I think I used the metaphor of the mosaic and a kind of choral song in the last paragraph of my concluding essay. And that's what gives Italian American culture such a vibrancy, and that's what we should be emphasizing.
Absolutely. And the last question that we received from the audience is, how has the Italian edition of the book been received in Italy?
Well, we had 5 very good reviews so far. We were supposed to present it at we had a great initial presentation at the Centro Studi Americani in Palazzo Mattei in downtown Rome. That was well attended and with some of the top experts in Italian American studies in Italy speaking. But we had scheduled then 5 different presentazioni that had to be canceled by COVID, unfortunately. But we've had so far, I think it's five very good reviews. I've been interviewed for Italian television about it, and so it looks wonderful. So every Italian scholar who sees it is pleased with it. I guess I don't know what more we could say at this point. The promotion has been stalled by COVID, though. Unfortunately, the book came out in January, just as COVID was really exploding.
I can imagine.
By March, everything had to be shut down.
Well, that being said, when we resume our operations, in person, which seems like such a strange concept now, we'd love to have you at the museum and some of the other authors at the book, that is, or other contributors. And we'd also like to remind our listeners that if you visit the Routledge website, and we'll post the flyer on our Facebook page, that you can receive a 20% discount by inputting the code FLR Frank Larry Ron 40. And it is really just a fascinating piece for anybody who's interested in Italian American experiences and history. We'd like to thank both of you for being here with us tonight, and all that you do to promote understanding and awareness of Italian American culture.
Thank you.
Thanks to you for all that you do.